Imagine you are sitting on your couch after experiencing the most difficult and exhausting day of your entire life. You do not speak a single word to anyone around you. You do not try to explain your frustration, but suddenly, and almost completely against your own conscious will, warm salt water begins to spill out of your eyes and run quietly down your face. We must ask why exactly your physical body does this. Every single animal on Earth possesses tear ducts that are specifically designed to clear away dust and lubricate their corneas to maintain vision. But you are the only creature on this entire planet that leaks fluid from your eyes specifically because you feel profound sadness. Before we dive deep into this biological mystery, I must make it clear to you in this response that the specific evolutionary theory defining emotional tears as a silent distress signal to evade predators is information from outside of the given sources, and you may want to independently verify that information. However, the incredible context of the prehistoric world, the complexity of animal emotions, and the brilliant ways ancient humans communicated and survived without words are all deeply rooted in the historical and scientific sources we are exploring today. To understand why you cry, we have to completely demolish a widespread myth about the animal kingdom, travel back millions of years into a terrifying prehistoric landscape, and look at a survival strategy so deeply wired into your nervous system that you still use it every single time your heart breaks. Let us begin with something that took modern researchers an embarrassingly long time to actually admit out loud, which is the undeniable fact that animals possess profound and complex emotions. For most of the 20th century, the dominant view in biology was behaviorism, the idea that animals were essentially just biological machines that reacted to stimuli without feeling anything real. This view was heavily influenced by a 17th century philosopher named Descartes, who argued that animals were essentially complex automatons, or biological robots, meaning the squealing of an animal was just a mechanism like the sound of a clock ticking. But when researchers started observing animals closely in the wild, that clinical and cold model fell apart completely. Chimpanzees who lost their companions would go through prolonged periods of lethargy, social withdrawal, and reduced eating that looked remarkably like human depression. Elephants would return to the bones of deceased herd members years later, sometimes traveling significant distances just to touch them gently with their trunks, in ways that served absolutely no practical survival function. Dolphins were observed staying near deceased calves long after any logical reason to do so had passed. The neurological architecture for emotion, specifically the limbic system, is an ancient biological tool that is hundreds of millions of years old and is present across virtually all mammals. Animals absolutely feel fear. They form deep attachments. They suffer, and they genuinely grieve, but they do not cry emotional tears. They may howl, they may withdraw, they may mourn, but their eyes do not weep from sorrow. Emotional crying remains an exclusively human phenomenon. So why did human beings develop this bizarre physiological response that temporarily blinds them with water exactly when they are in a state of deep emotional distress? The answer begins in a prehistoric world where making a loud sound could literally get you killed. We sometimes like to imagine ancient humans as tough and muscular warriors wrestling lions, but the reality was far more terrifying. Go back 2.5 million years to the era of early human ancestors. Early humans were biologically speaking a soft, slow, and poorly armed prey animal, living alongside predators that were built specifically to destroy things just like them. There were prehistoric hyenas the size of modern lions, with jaws strong enough to literally crush the femur of a full-grown elephant. There were multiple species of saber-toothed cats, with canine teeth up to 28 centimeters long. There were giant crocodiles and cave bears that stood 12 feet tall and weighed 1,000 kilograms. There was even a massive bird in New Zealand called the Haas seagull, which hunted prey roughly the size of a human and had talons comparable in size to the claws of a modern tiger. In this brutal environment, prey animals evolved to shape their entire existence around a landscape of fear, constantly modifying their behavior to avoid detection by predators. If an ancient human, perhaps a vulnerable infant or a severely injured adult, was in deep emotional or physical distress and vocalized that pain loudly by screaming or wailing, that sound would act as a beacon. It would immediately broadcast their exact location to every apex predator within miles. Crying out loud was an absolute biological liability in a world where danger was always listening in the dark. But here is the contradiction that ancient humans had to solve. Humans are profoundly social creatures who absolutely cannot survive in isolation. In a small, ancient band of 20 to 50 people, your survival, your access to shared resources, your defense against predators, and your recovery from illness depended entirely on your complete integration within the group. Group living is one of the oldest survival strategies in the animal kingdom, the one who gets caught by a predator. Furthermore, humans survive because they actively mobbed predators as a coordinated group, screaming and throwing objects to make the predator turn away, and calculate that the attack was simply not worth the massive risk of injury. Being excluded or ostracized from the band was not just a minor social discomfort. It was a delayed death sentence, because you could not hunt effectively alone. You could not defend yourself while sleeping, and you could not survive serious illness without the cooperative infrastructure of the group. Our ancestors desperately needed a way to signal intense vulnerability and beg for help from their community. This is exactly where the human face became one of the most sophisticated communication devices in the entire natural world. Before humans had spoken words, they had other incredible ways of transmitting complex meaning. And whatever that was, it kept us alive and beautifully coordinated. You can tell someone you are annoyed, confused, or terrified without producing a single syllable. The human face has 43 muscles, which is more than almost any other animal on the planet, and the overwhelming majority of them exist not for chewing or breathing, but exclusively for nuanced expression. Psychologists studying facial expressions across cultures have found that basic expressions are entirely universal, meaning genuine fear looks exactly the same in rural communities as it does in massive modern cities. These expressions are biological broadcasts, ancient evolutionary tools, meaning our ancestors were already transmitting and receiving emotional data this way, millions of years before anyone said a word. Our ancestors also communicated through posture, adopting movements that signaled threat or submission without a single vocalization. Furthermore, before words, there was also a deep chemical communication happening beneath our conscious awareness. Humans are extraordinarily sensitive to specific chemical signals that carry social information, meaning we can literally smell fear and stress in the sweat of others, triggering measurable changes in the neural states of the people who smell them. We were constantly communicating our internal emotional states to the entire group. In this context of silent and vital communication, tears became the ultimate visual gesture of need. Tears blur your own vision, which is a massive sacrifice of physical awareness, but they make your eyes shine and reflect light. They create a highly visible and unmistakable physical marker of distress on your face that can be easily seen by another empathetic human sitting across a glowing campfire, but cannot be heard by a leopard prowling in the dark forest outside the camp. When you cry, you are deploying an ancient social technology designed to trigger an immediate and overwhelming empathetic response from your tribe. And empathy, just as much as throwing spears or harnessing fire, was the actual secret weapon that allowed our incredibly fragile species to conquer the entire planet. We know with absolute certainty that ancient humans took extraordinary care of their vulnerable group members, long before modern medicine or formal moral philosophies ever existed. Archaeologists have discovered the skeleton of a Neanderthal in Iraq who had a withered and amputated arm, was partially blind, suffered significant hearing loss, and had survived incredibly serious leg injuries. By any ruthless calculus of pure survival efficiency, he would have been a massive physical liability. Yet he survived to the genuinely old age of 40 because his group chose to feed him, protect him, and keep him alive for many years. We have found the tiny skull of a child with significant developmental disabilities who lived 500,000 years ago and survived for 8 years in a harsh environment because someone loved that child fiercely enough to provide constant and demanding daily care. We have found numerous ancient skeletons with fully healed bone fractures, which definitively means the person survived long enough for the shattered bone to slowly knit back together. Someone patiently sat with them, someone brought them gathered food, and someone kept the protective fire going during weeks or months of total incapacitation. The excavated bones of ancient People absolutely do not tell a grim story of brutal savage indifference. They tell a beautiful and undeniable story of tight-knit communities that took care of each other in ways that cost them real precious resources and massive physical effort. The physical act of shedding tears tapped directly into this profound biological caregiving response. This deep instinct to protect the vulnerable is so powerfully wired into nature that it even crosses species lines through something researchers call the baby schema, like a large head relative to body size, big eyes, and a round face that acts as a deeply wired visual trigger. This visual trigger essentially short-circuits aggressive or dismissive responses across an enormous range of species and replaces them entirely with gentleness, protectiveness, and dramatically increased attention. We see this deep protective instinct echoing across the entire animal kingdom. Adult male chimpanzees show a dramatically different behavioral profile around infants, actively tolerating clumsy behavior that would absolutely trigger an immediate and serious violent response if an adult chimpanzee tried the exact same thing. Adult dogs playing with puppies will deliberately handicap themselves, exaggerating their movements and allowing the puppy to win small contests it would never win against a similarly sized adult. Elephants extend empathetic and comforting responses across species lines, approaching distressed animals of entirely different species with remarkably calm and reassuring behavior. We share this planet with creatures who possess an immense capacity for empathy and who have spent millions of years developing the capacity to feel for others. But the story gets even more fascinating when we look at how certain animals respond to human tears today. Topic: Why do humans cry from emotion? The weirdest habit in the animal kingdom. Even though animals do not cry emotional tears themselves, some of them have evolved specific cognitive adaptations exclusively to read ours. Let us go back to that terrible evening when you were sitting on your couch silently crying. Your dog did not try to offer you verbal advice. They did not try to reframe your problems. They simply offered warm, physical, and completely unconditional presence, right there in the absolute mess of it with you. How exactly did they know you were sad, without you explaining anything? For thousands of years, dogs have lived alongside humans, deeply integrated inside our social structures and our intimate emotional lives. Over that vast stretch of evolutionary time, through the relentless and patient logic of natural selection, dogs evolved specific cognitive adaptations, specifically for reading human emotional expressions. In scientific studies, dogs process human emotional faces using a left gaze bias, meaning they instinctively look first to the right side of a human face which most strongly communicates emotion, which is exactly the same specific bias that humans use when reading each other. They became, in a very real and measurable sense, biological experts in being human. But dogs do not just read the subtle muscles of your face. They read your actual chemical reality. A dog possesses roughly 300 million olfactory receptors, compared to a human having about 6 million. When you are experiencing genuine emotional distress, your body changes chemically. Your cortisol levels rise, your adrenaline shifts, your heart rate changes, and the composition of your sweat changes. These are real physical and molecular events, producing actual compounds that float off your body into the surrounding air, and your dog is picking up every single one of them. In clinical trials, dogs were able to identify stressed breath and sweat samples from humans, with an accuracy of over 93% from just a simple cotton swab. Your dog smells your profound sadness the way you would smell thick smoke from a fire 2 streets over. And when they detect this distress, they respond in ways that look unsettlingly close to conscious compassion. In a remarkable study conducted at Johns Hopkins University, owners were placed behind a transparent door with a magnetic latch and asked to express distress by crying. The dogs whose owners were crying were significantly more likely to push open the door to urgently reach them. But the most extraordinary detail of all was that these dogs opened the door more slowly and more calmly than dogs whose owners were just humming quietly. The researchers interpreted this striking behavior as the dogs actively regulating their own emotional arousal in order to be more present and useful to the human in distress. They were actively managing their own turbulent feelings so they could help you better. Other remarkable animals have developed their own unique ways of mapping human emotion across time. Cats build a bespoke and highly individualized emotional model of their specific person, through years of extremely close observation, knowing exactly what your specific movements mean when something is deeply wrong. Horses have been shown to powerfully encode emotional memories of angry or happy human faces from photographs, and intelligently act on those impressions hours later when meeting the actual person. Crows are terrifyingly intelligent and can recognize individual human faces, holding long-lasting grudges, or remembering people who have shown them genuine kindness by leaving them shiny gifts. Dolphins have been documented actively seeking help from human divers, holding perfectly still while humans methodically remove embedded fishing hooks from their bodies. A humpback whale that was freed from heavy crab trap lines deliberately circled back to approach each diver individually, making profound eye contact that left the researchers utterly astounded. These extraordinary interactions completely prove that wild animals are watching us far more carefully than we watch them, and they are fully capable of understanding vulnerability, kindness, and distress across the boundary of species. When you cry, you are not just signaling to the empathetic people or animals around you. You are also fundamentally changing your own internal physiological state. As the human body undergoes extreme emotional stress, it absolutely requires a biological release valve. We must also consider the extraordinary depth of the ancient human experience to fully appreciate why our emotions run so deep and why we need this release. Our ancestors did not just survive, they lived incredibly rich and profoundly connected lives. The absolute biggest lie that modern society has been fed about prehistoric life is that it was a constant, exhausting survival horror game. The genuine truth is that for the vast majority of human history, people enjoyed abundant, unscheduled, and genuinely free time, spending roughly 3 to 5 hours a day on necessary subsistence work, and devoting the entirety of the rest of their time to talking, playing complex physical games, making spectacular art, and resting deeply. They spent a massive portion of their non-working time, potentially 60 to 70% of all their social time, purely in conversation, gossiping enthusiastically, telling elaborate jokes, arguing passionately, and sharing exaggerated stories around the warm fire. Gossip was literally the original social technology that kept the human community functioning and cooperating, allowing humans to verbally groom many individuals at once to maintain massive social networks. Ancient humans slept communally in groups around central fires to protect each other from nocturnal predators, maintaining a rotating baseline of partial alertness throughout the night without anyone needing to deliberately assign guard duty. During the middle of the night, they engaged in a natural period of wakefulness, quietly talking with their families, meditating, or reflecting before returning to their second sleep. They took meticulous care of their sick and injured, using sophisticated plant-based medicine, discovering that willow bark reduced pain, and honey miraculously prevented severe wound infections. They performed complex skull surgeries with stone tools thousands of years ago, and patients genuinely survived. They traveled vast distances across continents, not as solitary wanderers, but as intensely cooperative groups sharing resources, reading the subtle signs of the landscape, and protecting the most vulnerable members of their tribes. Every single aspect of ancient human life was inextricably bound to the group, and the ability to communicate intense emotion was the invisible glue holding that entire magnificent structure together. In a world where your survival depended entirely on the empathy of your group, displaying your genuine emotional truth was not a luxury. It was a fundamental requirement for existence. Ancient humans were absolute experts at managing their stress and finding true cognitive rest, sitting peacefully by a fire long after dark and simply watching the flames. They let their thoughts arise and naturally dissolve without any forced agenda. Modern humans have collectively and accidentally engineered a chaotic environment in which genuine cognitive rest is almost impossible to achieve without immense deliberate effort, frantically filling every quiet moment with constant external input and algorithmic distractions. We endure far more psychological stress and get much less genuine rest than ancient people who were literally hunting wild, massive animals with nothing but sharpened wooden sticks. In this relentlessly anxious modern world, the physical act of crying remains one of the very few ancient biological mechanisms we still possess to actively release the overwhelming weight of our own complicated feelings. So what exactly does all of this vast evolutionary history mean for you right now as you quietly wipe the tears from your face? It means that the next time you feel slightly embarrassed about crying during a sad movie, or breaking down in your car after a terrible and exhausting day, or tearing up during a difficult emotional conversation with someone you deeply love, you need to remember what your incredible body is actually doing. You are not failing to hold your life together. You are not displaying a shameful lack of emotional control. You are executing a brilliant and deeply ancient survival strategy that successfully kept your incredibly brave ancestors alive. In a dark and unforgiving world full of terrifying threats, you are using a silent and beautiful language that predates spoken words by millions of years, a language so fundamentally powerful that it built the entire foundation of human empathy, allowed our ancestors to survive devastating ice ages, and quite literally convinced wild wolves to leave the freezing, dangerous forest and come sit warmly on our couches. Tears are not a biological malfunction, and they are absolutely not a sign of weakness. They are the visible, physical, and undeniable proof that you belong to an extraordinary species that survived the absolute worst conditions imaginable, not by fighting alone in the dark, but by bravely reaching out to each other and silently asking for help.